running late. We're in this large room because they said it was uncomfortable for people in the smaller rooms for the first panels, and they generously gave us this wonderful room. I'm Franklin Siegel. I'm a member of the National Lawyers Guild, and this is a panel called Blockade: Legal Basics for Solidarity Activists. And we're going to have a full program. It's not going to answer every question, but what we want to do is to sort of have two forms of information going on. One is information about what the blockade is and its history. And the other is that if there are lawyers and legal people out there, and perhaps on the live stream, because it's been distributed widely in the National Lawyers Guild across the country, is that because of the increase in solidarity activity, there are groups that need legal help. And of course, this is, not everyone's done this, and some of it is just eye-rolling. But we have a network in the Guild's Cuba Subcommittee, which basically will back up people at the end, or I'll even give it now, if you're on the live stream or if you are a lawyer in the audience and don't have time to come up. Give us your name on NLG Cuba SC, all one word, at gmail.com, and we will get in touch with you. But part of what we're trying to do is to increase the resources because there is a great deal of new activity going on. But first, we have two very honored guests who are going to join us, and one will address us. They are Bar Association officials from Havana who are in New York. We have Professor Yamila Gonzalez Ferrer, who's the Vice President of the Union Nacional de Juristas. Yamila has been at the meetings of the Women's Corps at the United Nations all of this week and is a frequent visitor there. She spoke in the women's panel this morning, so we are not going to, given the time, we're going to cut down the number of speakers. But I have the honor to introduce to you, before I introduce the panel, we'll have Alexis speak. Jose Alexis Gianarte Gato, who's the president of the Union Nacional de Juristas de Cuba. Alexis, won't you come forward and get us started on this panel? Viene aquí. Translating for Alexis. Testing. Mike, introduce yourself.
Testing. Martín Copel.
Buenas tardes a todas y todos, estimados compañeros y compañeras.
Good afternoon, everyone, friends, compañeros and compañeras,
Representantes y miembros de los grupos de solidaridad con Cuba,
representatives of the Cuba Solidarity Groups and with Cuba Solidarity Groups here,
embajadores y miembros de la misión de Cuba aquí en Nueva York.
and ambassadors and members of the Cuban mission to the United States here in New York.
Amigos y amigas,
Dear friends,
el mundo vive momentos de tensión, incertidumbre y profunda preocupación para la paz, la seguridad y la autodeterminación. Algunos anuncian que estamos a las puertas de la Tercera Guerra Mundial.
the world is living through moments of tension, uncertainty, and profound concern for peace, security, and self-determination. Some say that we are at the opening of a third world war.
El contexto actual nos convoca a seguir con detenimiento las rutas del crimen del bloqueo económico y financiero contra Cuba, Sin lugar a dudas, las medidas adoptadas recientemente por el actual gobierno de este país no tienen precedente en la historia de la nación cubana desde 1959.
Continúa.
Las actitudes groseras, imperiales y hegemónicas han causado crecientes pérdidas de daños materiales y humanos a través de una guerra despiadada que jamás otro pueblo ha vivido.
The current context calls on us to follow closely the course of the criminal, economic, and financial blockade against Cuba. Undoubtedly, the measures adopted recently by the current government of this country are unprecedented in the history of the Cuban nation since 1959. The crude, imperial, and hegemonic attitudes have caused increasing losses in material and human damage through a ruthless war that no other people has lived through.
Todos recordamos que hasta hace solo unos meses se pretendía confundir a la comunidad internacional exponiendo la retórica de que no existía el bloqueo contra Cuba, que las carencias y dificultades obedecían a la incapacidad del gobierno cubano de no dar respuesta a las necesidades crecientes de nuestro pueblo, de nuestro noble y heroico pueblo.
We all remember that just a few months ago, they wanted to confuse the international community with rhetoric saying that there is no blockade against Cuba, that the shortages and difficulties were due to the inability of the Cuban government to resolve the growing needs of our noble and heroic people.
La desfachatez y arrogancia del actual gobierno de los Estados Unidos ha roto todos los estándares de decencia y respeto a la comunidad internacional y a las normas internas del derecho internacional. Se ignoran los principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, se violan las convenciones y tratados internacionales que rigen las relaciones entre los Estados.
The brazenness and arrogance of the current government of the United States has broken all standards of decency and respect for the international community and for the both domestic norms and international law. They ignore the principles of the United Nations Charter. They violate the conventions and international treaties that govern relations between the states.
Cuba ha sido víctima desde el 1 de enero de 1959 de una persecución implacable por todas las administraciones estadounidenses. Los propósitos y principios de la Carta de la ONU que reafirman la igualdad soberana entre los estados, la no intervención, la no injerencia en los asuntos internos de los estados, la libertad de comercio y navegación internacional, son violados por los Estados Unidos al aplicar el bloqueo de la guerra económica que desde hace más de 67 años se mantiene contra el pueblo de Cuba.
Cuba has been a victim since January 1st, 1959, of an implacable persecution by all the U.S. administrations. The goals and principles of the UN Charter, which reaffirmed the sovereign equality of states and non-intervention, the non-interference in the internal affairs of states, the freedom of commerce and international shipping, are violated by the United States in the application of the blockade and economic war which they have waged against the people of Cuba for more than 67 years.
Veamos algunos de los antecedentes jurídicos dictados para sostener el genocida bloqueo a Cuba. En fecha 6...
Let us take a look at some of the legal history of how they have maintained the genocidal blockade against Cuba.
En fecha 6 de abril de 1960, Lester G. Mallory, vicesecretario de Estado asistente para los asuntos interamericanos, en un memorando secreto del Departamento de Estado, definía la filosofía del bloqueo económico, comercial y financiero impuesto meses después de forma unilateral contra Cuba.
On April 6, 1960, Lester D. Mallory, the Assistant Undersecretary of State of the United States, in a secret memorandum, a State Department memorandum, defined the philosophy of the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed just months afterwards in a unilateral way against Cuba.
El 5 de agosto de 1992, en ocasión de realizarse la audiencia del Subcomité Senatorial para Asuntos Hemisféricos para analizar el proyecto de la Ley Torricelli, el subsecretario adjunto para Asuntos Interamericanos del Departamento del Estado, señor Helms-Burton, declaró que esta ley solo trataría de afinar lo que los Estados Unidos venían haciendo en Cuba durante hace más de 30 años.
On August 5, 1992, at a hearing of the Senate Subcommittee for Hemispheric Affairs to discuss the Torricelli bill, the Undersecretary, the Undersecretary for American Affairs of the U.S. State Department, Mr. Gelbard, declared that this law would only fine-tune what the United States had been doing in Cuba against Cuba for more than 30 years.
La denominada Ley para la Democracia Cubana de 1992, conocida como Ley Torricelli, reforzó las medidas económicas contra Cuba y brindó sustento normativo a la extraterritorialidad del bloqueo.
The so-called Cuban Democracy Act of 1992, known as the Torricelli Law, reinforced the economic measures against Cuba and gave a legal framework for the extraterritorial character of the blockade.
Estados Unidos se ha provisto de una base legal de más de una treintena de leyes, órdenes ejecutivas y otros documentos jurídicos que se iniciaron con la Ley del Comercio para el Enemigo de 1917 y entre las que se destacan la Ley de Actividades Comerciales de 1974.
The United States has created a legal basis of more than 30 laws, executive orders, and other legal documents that began with the enforcement of the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, among which is the Trade Act of 1974.
La Ley para la Solidaridad Democrática y la Libertad Cubana de 1996, conocida como Ley Helms-Burton, y que nosotros denominamos Ley de la Esclavitud, busca desestimular la inversión extranjera e internacionalizar el bloqueo a Cuba con la denegación de la entrada a los Estados Unidos a los directivos de empresas extranjeras y a sus familiares que intervinieran en propiedades confiscadas en Cuba y estableció la posibilidad de presentar demandas en contra en los tribunales de Estados Unidos, ampliando aún más su alcance extraterritorial.
The so-called Democratic Solidarity and Cuban Freedom Law of 1996, known as the Helms-Burton Law, and which we call the Law of Slavery, seeks to discourage foreign investment and internationalizes the blockade against Cuba by barring the entry into the United States of heads of foreign companies and their relatives who invest in properties supposedly quote, confiscated in Cuba, and establishes the possibility of filing lawsuits against them in U.S. courts, broadening even more its extraterritorial reach.
El bloqueo contra Cuba no es una cuestión bilateral entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos. La repetida aplicación extraterritorial de leyes norteamericanas y la persecución contra los legítimos intereses de empresas y ciudadanos de terceros países afectan significativamente la soberanía de muchos otros estados.
The blockade against Cuba is not simply a bilateral issue between Cuba and the United States. The repeated extraterritorial enforcement of U.S. laws and the targeting of the legitimate interests of companies and citizens of third countries have a major impact on the sovereignty of many other states.
Al amparo de esta política, continúan aplicándose sanciones a empresas norteamericanas y europeas por realizar transacciones con Cuba. Las personas enfermas en Cuba no pueden beneficiarse en muchas ocasiones de nuevos medios de diagnóstico, tecnologías y medicamentos, aunque de ellos dependan sus vidas, porque independientemente de que estos fueron producidos o estén disponibles en un tercer país, las leyes del bloqueo prohíben que Cuba los adquiera si alguno de sus componentes o programas proceden de los Estados Unidos.
Under these policies, sanctions continue to be imposed on U.S. and European companies engaged in transactions with Cuba. People who are ill, suffering from illnesses in Cuba, cannot benefit in many cases from new diagnostic tools, technologies, and medicine, even though their lives may depend on it. Because regardless of whether they were produced or are available in a third country, the laws of the blockade prohibit Cuba to acquire or purchase them if some of their components or programs originate in the United States.
La extensión de las legislaciones y regulaciones antes mencionadas demuestra, además, que ningún bloqueo ha sido tan abarcador y brutal contra un pueblo como el que los Estados Unidos ha mantenido contra Cuba. Por ello califica como un acto de genocidio, en virtud del inciso C del artículo 2 de la Convención de Ginebra para la prevención y sanción del delito de genocidio de 1948 y como acto de guerra económica, de acuerdo con lo establecido en la Declaración relativa al derecho de la guerra marítima adoptada en la Conferencia Naval de Londres de 1909.
The extension of the laws and regulations that I mentioned before demonstrates also that there has been no blockade so all-encompassing and brutal against the people like the one that the U.S. has maintained against Cuba. That's why it constitutes an act of genocide, as defined by Clause C of Article 2 of the Geneva Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide of 1948, and as an act of economic war, according to the declaration of the Law of Maritime Warfare adopted by the Naval Conference of London in 1909.
La reciente orden ejecutiva dictada por el presidente Trump, declarando que Cuba es una amenaza para los Estados Unidos y disponiendo la imposición de aranceles a los países que vendan petróleo a Cuba, ratifica el acto de guerra económica descrito.
The recent executive order issued by President Trump declaring that Cuba is a threat to the United States and imposing tariffs on countries that sell oil to Cuba represents an act of economic warfare as described before.
En este sentido, se han identificado dos grupos de normas internacionales que resultan violadas por el comportamiento del gobierno de los Estados Unidos. El primer grupo se corresponde con las normas que son reconocidas como la base estructural del derecho internacional contemporáneo y entre las que se destacan la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y la Resolución 2625, adoptada por la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas en 1970 y denominada Principios del Derecho Internacional, que rigen las relaciones de amistad y cooperación entre los Estados. Ambos instrumentos jurídicos internacionales contienen un grupo de normas imperativas de jus cogens internacional y hacen nulo cualquier acto o negocio jurídico contrario a dichas normas.
Termina el párrafo.
En el segundo grupo se agrupan otros instrumentos jurídicos internacionales, entre los que destacan la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Civiles y Políticos, el Pacto Internacional de los Derechos Económicos y Sociales y Culturales y la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos, los que gozan de reconocimiento universal y son expresión de la voluntad concertada de los miembros de la sociedad internacional contemporánea.
In this sense, there have been two sets of international norms that have been violated by the actions of the U.S. government. The first set are norms that are recognized as the structural basis for contemporary international law, including the United Nations Charter and Resolution 2625, Roman 25, adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1970, and called Principles of International Law, which govern the relations of friendship and cooperation between states. Both in these international legal instruments include a set of norms, international norms, and nullify any action or business or legal business contrary to such norms. In the second set, it includes other international legal instruments, including the Universal Declaration of Civil Rights, Civil and Political Rights, the International Pact for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which are universally recognized and are an expression of the consistent desire of the members of the international community today.
Es decir, que las medidas coercitivas unilaterales impuestas por el gobierno de los Estados Unidos contra Cuba, con independencia de la denominación que se utilice, tienen un carácter violatorio del derecho internacional, teniendo en cuenta la intencionalidad y su carácter continuado, las que han ido agudizándose y por tanto deben ser identificadas como un acto violatorio de las normas de jus cogens del derecho internacional contemporáneo.
That is, the unilateral coercive measures imposed by the U.S. government against Cuba, regardless of what they are called, violate international law, taking into account the intentional character and their ongoing character, which have been becoming more intense and therefore must be described as violations of the norms of international contemporary law.
Al respecto, la Resolución 56/83 del año 2001 de la Asamblea General, contentiva del proyecto de artículos sobre responsabilidad del Estado por hechos internacionalmente ilícitos, reconoce en su artículo 1 que todo hecho internacionalmente ilícito de un Estado da lugar a la responsabilidad internacional de éste, y en su artículo 3, como elemento del hecho ilícito internacional, que éste puede ser resultante de una acción u omisión o ambas y dicho comportamiento viola el ordenamiento jurídico internacional. Las acciones del gobierno estadounidense contra Cuba tipifican de manera clara los elementos del hecho ilícito internacional.
With respect to Resolution 56/83 of 2001 of the General Assembly, contained in the draft Articles on Responsibility of States for Internationally Wrongful Acts, recognizes in its first article that, quote, every internationally wrongful act of a state entails an international responsibility of that state, and in Article 3, as elements of an internationally wrongful act, that this can result in an action or omission or both, and such conduct violates the international legal order. The actions of the U.S. government against Cuba typify clearly the elements of an internationally wrongful act.
Consecuentemente, el bloqueo de Estados Unidos contra Cuba viola las principales normas imperativas reconocidas en el derecho internacional contemporáneo, atenta contra el pleno disfrute de los derechos humanos del pueblo de Cuba, de ciudadanos de terceros países y de los propios ciudadanos estadounidenses.
As a result, the U.S. blockade against Cuba violates the principal norms recognized in contemporary international law, threaten the full enjoyment of human rights of the people of Cuba, of the citizens of third countries, and of the U.S. citizens themselves.
Con esta política se ha pretendido socavar la soberanía de nuestro país y de otros Estados miembros de las Naciones Unidas. El entramado de órdenes, regulaciones y leyes de todo tipo que conforman el bloqueo son rechazadas y denunciadas por amplios sectores de la comunidad internacional como una aberración jurídica y una afrenta a la soberanía y la independencia cubana, por su carácter extraterritorial, injerencista y genocida.
This policy has been used to try to undermine the sovereignty of our country and other member states of the United Nations. The complex of or series of orders, regulations, and laws of all kind that make up the blockade have been rejected and denounced by broad sectors of the international community as a legal aberration and an affront to the sovereignty and independence of Cuba because of its extraterritorial, interventionist, and genocidal character.
Los Estados miembros de las Naciones Unidas deben exigir que los órganos principales de esta, especialmente la Asamblea General y el Consejo de Seguridad, adopten las medidas necesarias para salvaguardar la paz y el cumplimiento de los propósitos de la Carta y exigir el cese de las violaciones de sus normas. Resulta también imperativo, consecuentemente, velar por el cumplimiento de las convenciones y tratados internacionales dictadas para coadyuvar al cumplimiento de tales propósitos.
The UN member states must demand that the main organs of the United Nations, especially the General Assembly and Security Council, adopt the necessary measures to protect peace and the fulfillment of the goals of the Charter and demand an end to the violations of its norms. It is also imperative, as a result, to ensure compliance with the international conventions and treaties to help fulfill such goals.
Ustedes con su actuar constituyen para el mundo, en la defensa de la dignidad de los pueblos, en la defensa de las relaciones cívicas, en la defensa de la libertad y el respeto, en la defensa del amor al ser humano y en la defensa de la justicia y la paz, un verdadero ejemplo.
You, with your actions, constitute an example for the world in defense of the dignity of peoples and the defense of civic relations and the defense of freedom and respect, in the defense of love of humanity, in the defense of justice and peace.
Como ideas finales, quisiera transmitir que la batalla que enfrentamos no es solo política, ni es económica, es ante todo una batalla jurídica. Se trata de la defensa de la civilización frente a la barbarie de la ley del más fuerte.
As final thoughts, I would like to say that the battle that we're facing is not only political or economic, it is above all a legal battle. It is about the defense of civilization in face of the barbarism of the law of the strongest.
El camino es el multilateralismo, la unidad regional y el uso inteligente y valiente de las herramientas que el propio derecho internacional nos ofrece.
The road forward is multilateralism, regional unity, and the intelligent and courageous use of the tools that international law itself offers us.
Como juristas, personas de bien, intelectuales, tenemos un deber histórico, ser la voz de la ley frente a la fuerza, de la razón frente a la intimidación y de la paz frente a la agresión.
As jurists, as people of goodwill, as intellectuals, we have a historic duty to be the voice of legality in face of force, of reason in face of intimidation, of peace in face of aggression.
No al genocidio contra Cuba. Viva la paz y la solidaridad. Cuba sí, bloqueo no. Patria o muerte, venceremos.
No to the genocide against Cuba. Long live peace and solidarity. Cuba sí, bloqueo no. Patria o muerte, venceremos. I won't translate that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the honor of your presence, Yamila and Alexis, and for getting us off to a start. This is sort of a practical panel, and it's going to be a little bit of a downer because there's a lot of no, 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 you can't, you can't, you can't. But the takeaway that we want to do is giving you the tools to go forward. First, let me give a shout out to Dr. Rosemary Mealy, who you all know is Dr. Rosemary Mealy, but to us is Rosemary Mealy, J.D., graduate of CUNY Law School, friend of Haywood Burns. Send you greetings from the Guild. Let me introduce our panel so we can get right to it. I'm not going to tell you all about them because you can read on the web what goes on. Stephanie Bastinet is a very busy lawyer at this particular point. She works in immigration law and is doing a lot of rapid response work, and thank her very much for taking the time to be here today. For those of you who attended last year, Stephanie got a big shout out at the plenary at the end of last year's conference. One of the all-stars of the Solidarity Movement, Ana Maria Cardenas, who somehow decided to go to law school after working at IFCO, where she had it good. And now she is an attorney in New York. She has taken hundreds of people to Cuba, and you can look on the web for her biography, so that we don't run out the clock. Margaret Kunstler is one of the giants of people's law and anti-repression law in the country. And her work with Cuba goes back long, 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 and you will hear an aspect of that today. But you know, her bio is just astounding, and please take the time to review it if you haven't looked at it already on the web. Another legend on this amazing group of people, who is not a lawyer, we need to say that because we don't want you to mistake her good words for legal advice, something New York Bar requires us to say to you, is Gloria La Riva, the coordinator of the Free the Five Committee, and who in this particular period of need in Cuba has started the Outway Project, which we're going to use as an example of the kinds of efforts that people are trying to start across the country. And Gloria is going to share with us a little bit of how you get such things up and running. And also, her, I think, surprise she shared with me on the telephone that she's getting some yeses for some of the things she wants to do from the regulators. So pay close attention to these rules because Gloria has figured out how to use them quite well. And I'm Franklin, and you can read what goes on here. I'm going to be running the computer. We didn't have time to rehearse in this room. Panelists, you can either speak from here or speak from your seats as you wish. And our friend from WBAI, Mimi Rosenberg, if you can sit from the seats, I'm going to move her microphone over to you because it isn't picking it up from the main microphone. So this is an informational workshop. And the To lay the foundation for the topics the panel speakers will be addressing, we'd like to start by outlining the origin and the current legal framework of the blockade. Alexis gave you a little bit of that, but we're going to go a little bit deeper into the weeds because what we're dealing with today is less international law than what the bureaucrats are doing to sort of target Cuba and criminalize certain activities that happen when you travel in the wrong way or send things to Cuba in the wrong way. And we have only to look back on the George W. Bush administration, where when they tightened the travel rules after Clinton had relaxed them a little bit, people were hit with what are called civil penalties, which is like the sanitation department for not cleaning the sidewalk in front of your building. It's sort of like, you've got this fine and prove that you're not a witch, and you lose. And the penalties are high. So what we want to do is help you figure your way around it. We're going to be much more limited than the range of topics that are covered by this book. We're going to project a few of the ones that you need. It's on the web, but if you are near a law library or a research library, take a look at 31 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, which we'll explain in a minute, and look at the table of contents and look at the range of topics and behaviors which are covered. All of us are going to, on the panel, are going to try to frame legal doctrine and complex rules in plain, down-to-earth language so we can explain some of this to you. But the technical mechanisms which underpin the blockade go to money and trade. They're regulating money. So money is anything which is a financial transaction with Cuba or a Cuban entity. The lodging payment that you make, the air ticket that you buy, and even if you buy it on American Airlines, where it's an American airline and the money doesn't go to Cuba, that airplane is paying a landing fee to a Cuban airport. And that is enough of a hook for a violation if you don't fit within one of the licenses. And you can look at the list of licenses that will be on the screen shortly. If you have one of the programs in the Marisol travel ad, it lists the categories of travel. If you buy a meal, if you buy an ice cream cone, how many people have been to Havana's Copelia Park? That ice cream cone is trading with the enemy under these rules. Gifts of money, souvenirs, books and CDs. The legal basics for their power to do this, and this isn't meant to be too deep a civics lesson, but you've heard a lot about the tariffs, so you know the difference between the Constitution and laws and what the executive can do and what Congress can do. But the legal basics behind the blockade are the Constitution allocates to Congress the regulation of trade and commerce. But Congress has delegated what might be called a blank check to the executive branch to deal with financial international emergencies. And what the delegation of those operations are, Alexis mentioned that there was a declaration of an emergency early in the blockade. The bureaucracy then puts together very detailed rules. And they're in this book, which is not a statute book, but it's a kind of list of rules, just like don't throw a candy wrapper in Union Square Park, or you will be fined. And it's called the Cuban Assets Control Regulations. So the blockade was put in very quickly, and it bears some resemblance to some of the things that are going on now. So just quickly, I want to go into some of it. At its core, of course, the blockade is an expression of the United States government's foreign policy to Cuba, and it's imposed through the control of money and financial interactions. The blockade's origins unfolded in the short time frame. 1959 was the triumph of the revolution and the establishment of the revolutionary government on January 5th. During February through May, there was a series of social reforms by the revolutionary government. On May 17, 1959, the U.S. State Department protested seizure of U.S. property without compensation. 1960, January 29th, President Eisenhower seeks authority to cut off Cuba's sugar quota. And at the time, the U.S. was Cuba's main market for sugar, which was 25% of Cuba's GNP in 1958. Big slice of the economy being shut down. February 13, 1960, Cuba sold sugar to the USSR in exchange for petroleum products. You go sell it elsewhere. June 7th, under pressure from the US government, because Cuba had sold sugar to the Soviet Union and was going around the intention of the United States, the US government put pressure on Shell, Esso, now known as Exxon, and Texaco to refuse to refine Soviet petroleum, which is how the USSR was paying for their sugar. June 29th, Cuba nationalized American-owned oil refineries because they were refusing to refine the oil. July 6th, Eisenhower canceled sugar quota altogether. August 7th, Cuba nationalized all U.S.-owned industrial and agrarian enterprises. So the farms, the Dole, pineapple packaging plants, and most of all, sugar. September 17th, Cuba nationalized the banks. October 2nd, all remaining U.S. enterprises in Cuba were nationalized. So you've got Bacardi Rum, you've got the telephone company, you've got all of that. Meanwhile, on August 28th, all at the U.S. behest, the Organization of American States adopted the Declaration of San Jose condemning the attempt of Sino-Soviet powers to make use of political, economic, or social situation of any American state. So we see sort of the parallels now, that meeting last weekend of the conservative nations and sort of how pressure is put on to create pressure on Cuba. October 19th, the U.S. announced general controls to prohibit American exports to Cuba, except for non-subsidized foodstuffs, machines, and medical supplies. Vice President Nixon described this policy as an all-out quarantine. And the word quarantine packs legal meaning. Quarantines are an act of war under international law. 1961, April 17th through April 19th. What happened? The Bay of Pigs. 10 days after the invasion, President Castro urged the U.S. to enter negotiations to establish peaceful coexistence, diplomatic relations, and even friendly relations if the U.S. so desires, close quote. The United States immediately rejected that because, quote, communism in this hemisphere is not negotiable. This is the State Department's communique. August 10th, at an OAS meeting in Punta del Este, Uruguay, the Kennedy administration, Kennedy came in January 61, the Kennedy administration pressed many steps to isolate Cuba. Che at that meeting pledged that Cuba will not intervene in Latin America if the U.S. stops supporting counter-revolutionaries inside and outside of Cuba. 1962, January 19th, Cuba rejects the U.S. ultimatum to break its ties with communist countries within 60 days. They're talking about China and the Soviet Union at that point, or face, quote, automatic sanctions, said the State Department. January 24th, Cuba is expelled from the OAS, the Organization of American States. The rubber is about to hit the road. February 7th, there's an embargo on U.S.-Cuban trade except for medical supplies proclaimed by the president a week earlier, and it goes into effect. March 23rd, the Kennedy administration puts an embargo on the importation of all goods made from Cuban materials anywhere. And the footnote in the book says Kennedy had laid in a large supply of cigars. October, an escalation in tension. What happened in October 62? The missile crisis. So July 63, everything is frozen. The embargo's in place. The rules are being put in. July 8th, 63, the State Department orders a freeze of Cuban assets in U.S. banks. U.S. banks, which had, of course, been the transfer agent for commerce, had money in it that belonged to Cuba. It's frozen. March 13th, the U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk spells out objectives to the U.S. trade embargo to the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. July 26th, they chose this for humor. The OAS voted for mandatory termination of all trade and diplomatic relations with Cuba throughout Latin America. So while that timeline lays out political events, there was a legal process that was put in place behind that. Effectively, the U.S. trade embargo on Cuba began on July 6, 1960, when Eisenhower canceled the sugar quota, when the U.S. government declared a ban on all exports to Cuba on October 19, 1960. Trade between the two countries ended, with the exception of some medicines and foodstuffs. The blockade, and this sets it up for Ana Maria, the blockade was implemented initially through 3 laws, because you can't make proclamations until recently, but it's done through laws. And it was done through powers that Congress, which regulates commerce and money and trade, delegated to the president to declare an emergency. That's the framework we'll be working in today. And a fourth is the Helms-Burton Act, which was passed in 1996. There'll be more about that later. An old special issue of the Center for Cuban Studies newsletter called The U.S. Blockade, A Documentary History, has a great quote from a congressional researcher. If any of you do research, the Congressional Research Service is this nonpartisan organization that does studies, nonpartisan studies for Congress, and they're usually pretty rigorous. My students used to love to do term papers using that as sources. But here is the quote. The legal foundation of the U.S. embargo on trade with Cuba is essentially contained in 3 statutes. The Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, which was passed to provide tools for the embargo against Cuba. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, a very powerful statute that basically allows the president to declare emergencies and do extraordinary things of the president's own volition. And the Export Administration Act of 1969. The first 2 statutes provide the legal authority for the promulgation of the Cuban Assets Control Regulations, 31 CFR 515, which prohibit virtually all commercial and financial transactions with Cuba or Cuban nationals, absent specific authorization, therefore, from the Secretary of Treasury or his designee. These regulations are currently being administered by the Office of Foreign Assets Control of the Treasury. That's the rules that are used to travel, to send materials, to probate estates, and 1,000 other things that we're not going to talk about today because time doesn't permit, and this is not a graduate seminar. The third statute, the Economic Administration Act of 1969, empowers the Department of Commerce to control exports to achieve 3 policy objectives. On February 3rd, 1962, President Kennedy issued Proclamation 3447, which established an embargo on trade with Cuba. That succinctly describes the overall framework of the economic relations that we have with Cuba. So for purposes of solidarity rules of the road, we're going to zero in on the Cuban Assets Control Regulations, because that's stuff that we want to do in building friendships with Cuba, visiting, sending money to family members, bringing in cultural materials like records and CDs and so on. So before I turn it over to Ana Maria, U.S. Constitution allocated the role of foreign trade to Congress. Congress delegated the power to the executive for purposes of the blockade of Cuba. This took place through the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. The Trading with the Enemy Act, you've all learned the word IEPA during the tariff debate. You're now going to learn a new word that's older called TWIA. which is what legal people call the Trading with the Enemy Act. So TWIA allows the executive, when the executive has declared an emergency, to set rules for the administration of financial relations when the president declares an emergency exists. By long-standing legal tradition, courts don't second-guess such presidential declarations. There's this whole jurisprudence that the president controls relations beyond our shores. And courts don't want to get in the middle most of the time to say who's right, although there are certain exceptions. But the rules for how sanctions are imposed by the executive branch, and in the case of Cuba, they're codified in the CFR. The section that we are going to deal with, and which Anna Maria is about to take over, which I will put on the board, is section CFR, 31 CFR, section 515.501 through 31 CFR 515.591. And Anna Maria is going to address a section called Licenses, Authorizations, and Statements of Licensing Policy. There's a huge number of categories, and Anna Maria is going to address some key ones. Do you want to do it from up here, Anna Maria? And in the meantime, I will be your Vanna White today, and we'll put some of the statutes on the screen.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Franklin has said, we certainly can't cover all of the topics that the CFR contains as it regards to the U.S. Treasury rules for implementing the U.S. embargo, but we're going to take a brief look at some of the key topics with relevance to solidarity work. First, an essential framework of the blockade is called licensing, which in plain language is everything is prohibited except certain kinds of activities involving financial transactions, such as travel, which the Treasury Department says can take place, and many of you have probably traveled under these regulations, even though you probably didn't know that at the time. There are two kinds of licenses. One is a general license, referred to as 31 CFR subsection 515.317. Which means that if there is a published permission in the Cuban asset control regulations, a person or a solidarity organization may engage in this transaction. The other is a specific license, 31 CFR 515 subsection 318, where an activity involving a financial transaction is not the subject of an exception to the blockade in the form of a general license, the Treasury can issue a written permission to engage in the transaction. For example, until the early 1990s, sending humanitarian aid required a shipment-by-shipment specific license, a time-consuming and limiting framework, which you'll learn about later from Ms. Gloria Lariva. I'm going to be talking now about travel, specifically solidarity people-to-people travel, which is where I have the most experience during my time as a caravan coordinator with IFCO Pastors for Peace. The embodiment of solidarity is people-to-people contact and the ability to learn about the experience of the Cuban people firsthand for ourselves. While the right to travel and pathways to learn about Cuba in person are now relatively established, and there is a general license to engage in financial transactions related to certain categories of travel now found under the CFR in section 515.560, it was not originally the design of the U.S. government to allow travel at all. It took many years and many acts of courage to break what began as a travel ban ordered by President Kennedy in 1962. Though the story is long, it's worth looking at a few important milestones that paved the way for our travel to Cuba now. William Worthy, a correspondent for the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, had earlier traveled to the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China in the late 1950s, in violation of a U.S. prohibition on using a U.S. passport to travel to those nations. In 1961, traveling without a passport so as to not violate then existing laws prohibiting travel to Cuba using a U.S. passport, Worthy went to Cuba and filed reports, including an interview with Fidel Castro. Upon returning, he was arrested in Florida and indicted on a charge of entering the country illegally, that is, without a passport, although upon entering the country, he had shown the immigration officers his birth certificate as proof of citizenship. In 1962, in a non-jury trial in a federal court in Miami, Mr. Worthy's lawyers included William M. Kunstler, the legendary movement lawyer and husband of our panelist, Margaret Kunstler, who was also a member of the National Lawyers Guild. Worthy was found guilty and sentenced to 3 months imprisonment plus 9 months of probation. This case caused a sensation, and there were rallies on behalf of Mr. Worthy all around the world. The British philosopher Bertrand Russell petitioned the United States Attorney General Robert Kennedy in support of him. In fact, the legendary folk singer Philip Osh wrote the Ballad of William Worthy, which included these lines: "William Worthy isn't worthy to enter our door. Went down to Cuba, he's not American anymore. But somehow it is strange to hear the State Department say you're living in the free world, and in the free world you must stay." It's funny because, they limit they say we're the freest country in the world, and yet we're not allowed to see Cuba for ourselves and penalized for doing so to this day. In 1964, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit overturned this conviction, ruling that the lack of a passport was insufficient ground to bar a citizen from re-entering the country. Concurring in the opinion was Judge Griffin B. Bell, a future United States Attorney General under President Jimmy Carter. Mr. Worthy was not granted a new passport until 1968, 4 years later. Over the years, his other travels, with a passport or without, took him to North Vietnam, Indonesia, Cambodia, and Algeria. Similarly, organizers of travel to Cuba were charged with criminal offenses. In 1967, U.S. v. Lobb, NLG member Leonard Bowden won a victory in the U.S. Supreme Court when it affirmed dismissal of a prosecution for arranging travel of 58 Americans to Cuba. In that same time period, the McCarthy-era practice of the U.S. denying passports to activists like Paul Robeson in order to deny them a right to travel was ruled illegal by the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Zemel v. Rusk, which recognized a constitutional right of U.S. citizens to travel. But while Americans and people subject to U.S. jurisdiction, which means non-citizens residing in the U.S., could legally travel to Cuba, the economic restrictions of the blockade under the Trading with the Enemy Act and the CFR, Cuban Asset Control Regulations, presented a de facto travel ban. You could travel, but you couldn't pay for travel to or in Cuba. This queued up a test of an individual's constitutional rights. If there was a constitutional right to travel and an economic restriction against paying to travel to Cuba, would the economic restrictions created by a president have to yield to an individual's constitutional right to travel? This particular issue was litigated again by the legendary attorney Leonard Bowden with panelist Margaret Ratner, who participated in the litigation as attorneys for the Center for Constitutional Rights. And the Supreme Court, in a case titled Reagan v. Wald, unfortunately ruled that the emergency economic powers that the president had been given by Congress in the Trading with the Enemy Act could simultaneously exist with the constitutional right to travel. Stated otherwise, one could travel to Cuba, one just could not engage in economic transactions in connection with the travel, meaning one could not pay for airfare, for lodging, meals, or that ice cream at Coppelia's. But travel rules under the blockade evolved through the political organization of activists and others. In solidarity with Cuba, the young generations, which fought for civil rights and opposed imperialist war in Vietnam, were not willing to be deterred. In 1969, the first Venceremos Brigade was formed by young Americans who took a tramp freighter from Canada to Cuba to work helping Cuba in its sugarcane harvest. Their political goal was to break the blockade, which they did by defying the travel ban. This amazing journey is recounted in two wonderful books, Venceremos Brigade by Sandra Levinson of the Center for Cuban Studies, and the recent book, Cuban Revolution in America by Professor Tirsan Latner. The brigade continues to travel in solidarity with Cuba to this day. As Gail mentioned, she participated in one of their brigades at the behest of Dr. Rosemary Mealy. A similarly bold travel group took place in 1977 when 55 young adults who had been brought to the United States from Cuba as children in the aftermath of the revolution formed the Antonio Maceo Brigade. Many of you may know them as Operation Peter Pan. They traveled to Cuba to begin a process of people-to-people called the dialogue, ultimately leading to the establishment of a way for Cubans who had fled the United States to return to Cuba for family reunification visits. Which brings us to the current framework for travel. The travel rules under the general license grants a permission where a traveler can go without individual written authorization from the Treasury to engage in financial transactions have morphed over the years. Sometimes rules were relaxed for presidents who sought to lessen tensions with Cuba, like President Carter, Clinton, and Obama, and sometimes other administrations tightened those travel restrictions. In fact, under the Obama administration, it became so lax that people now think that there is no travel ban. That's not correct, though. Under the Cuban asset control regulations, travel-related financial transactions attendant to traveling to Cuba, that is, paying for your travel, exists in two forms, as I mentioned at the beginning. One is a specific grant of permission from the Treasury Department office called a specific license for a specific person or group to engage in travel-related travel to Cuba, which is very hard to get and rarely granted. The other is a general license under the Cuban asset control regulation to engage in travel-related transactions, which amounts to, as long as you fit this category, you may travel to Cuba as long as you follow the rules of this regulation. It's quite long, and many of you have probably traveled to Cuba under this license if you didn't know it. For example, I have traveled to Cuba under the education license when I went to do a one-week semester at the University of Havana with CUNY Law.
But of course, the regulation says don't go to the beach.
We didn't go to the beach,
Go to class and go back to your room.
which we did. We had no fun. Between classes, I would run down the stairs to a cafe and get a cafe cubano and just shoot it up and then run back to class. So that's the most fun I had. The scope of these activities of who can utilize this general license were discussed in the earlier workshop. But as you look at this list and read the related regulation next to the category, what emerges is an authorization to travel applicable to many kinds of solidarity activities, such as humanitarian projects, educational activities, professional research, and professional meetings, and support for the Cuban people, which is the broadest category. This may sound easy and breezy, but take it slow. Remember that someone who engages in travel-related financial transactions outside authorizations from a general or specific license may face substantial civil and criminal penalties. Civil penalties can be imposed by the Treasury Department up to $108,489 per violation. And criminal penalties after a trial can include a prison sentence of up to 20 years. And in fact, under this license, you're actually required to hold on to receipts in case you are audited in the future. And I was cleaning my room the other day, and I found all of the receipts from the last two trips I made in 2019 and 2017. So the statute of limitations has not been reached, and I will not be throwing out those documents. People or groups contemplating travel to Cuba should consult the current travel sanction rules of the Treasury on the website of the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Controls, because the rules can change quickly, especially under this administration, when we have an administration that is engaged in fostering tensions in relations with Cuba, to say the least. But travel services providers in the U.S., which handle Cuba-related travel, also publish very up-to-date rules and will assist solidarity groups exploring group travel to analyze the travel regulations for the contemplated solidarity activity. Many of you may have already reached out to them. Some of them are Alta Turista, Global Exchange, and Mar Azul. And to illustrate the detail and complexity of travel-related general licenses, let's look at the category of 515-560 called Support for the Cuban People, which, as I mentioned, is the broadest category, which then takes you to subsection 515-574. When thinking of possible travel, be sure to thoroughly examine both the general license listing and any additional sections which elaborate on the category. With respect to travel, agencies and organizations which regularly service or organize educational travel to Cuba can be helpful in analyzing whether the kind of travel your group is interested in fits with a general license. Professor Franklin Siegel mentioned briefly the remittances, and this also falls under the CFR. The Cuban Asset Control Regulation also provides for persons in the U.S. to periodically send fixed amounts of money to persons or entities in Cuba, referred to as remittances. One of the most frequently used are the remittances to family members in Cuba. These are now also there are also now a number of others specified in the Cuban Asset Control Regulations at 31 CFR 515-570. Detailed information on remissions rules are available on the Treasury Department Office of Foreign Asset Control website and from companies which handle remissions like Western Union. It's important to know that depending on which administration is in power, that the remissions are limited, which exacerbate the economic conditions of Cuban people. So you can see that the way that the U.S. attacks Cuba is not just through an economic embargo on a state level, but also on a very personal level. Finally, some of the publications and intellectual property, such as film, videos, and recorded sound media that people bring back from Cuba that we now take for granted, was not always available to us here in the States. In May 1981, the Reagan administration instituted an embargo on publications of Cuban origin arriving in the U.S. Subscribers to the Cuban newspaper, Grandma, or any other Cuban periodical could no longer receive even a single copy of such a publication without first securing an import license from the U.S. Treasury Department. All Cuban periodicals arriving in Boston, the major port of entry at the time, were seized. Authority for such action was claimed under the Trading with the Enemy Act. The Office of Foreign Asset Control of the U.S. Treasury Department, the department charged with the act's enforcement, determined that under the act it could prohibit all importation, paid or unpaid, or even one copy of such publication. However, in the fall of 1981, the Center for Constitutional Rights, National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee, and the National Lawyers Guild attorneys filed a federal court action in Boston challenging the embargo. Among the over 100 plaintiffs who joined the suit were The Nation, The Guardian, The Progressive, and the Boston Committee to End the Blockade, as well as individual doctors, lawyers, scholars, journalists, theologians, and others harmed by the seizure. The suit charged that the embargo interferes with the First Amendment rights, and was not justified by the minimal economic effect such an action would have on Cuba. One of the plaintiffs, a physician, asserted that the free flow of medical information is well accepted as important in the fight against disease. He added that the embargo prevents me from adequately engaging in this fight to which I am dedicated. Another plaintiff, a Cuban-born sociologist, explained that applying for a license would subject me to government investigation or even prosecution and to harassment from violent Cuban exile groups from whom I have previously received phone death threats. The complaint also alleged that the embargo was beyond the authority delegated by Congress to the executive branch of government by the Trading with the Enemy Act. On January 28, 1982, the Treasury Department relented and ordered the release of the stored literature, and shortly thereafter issued a regulation dropping the license requirements for single copies of Cuban publications. Over the years, this regulation has evolved to permit importation of a range of information and informational materials covered by the First Amendment, such as publications, films, posters, phonograph records, photographs, CDs, artworks, and news feeds. So, in summation, it's a complex framework, but it's one that legal advocates and people-to-people participants have taken a role in chipping away at the U.S.'s embargo. They cannot keep us from interacting with our brothers and sisters, and although they will continue to do so now under this administration, you all being here shows that they will not be able to continue to do so without resistance.
We have to be out by 6. I'm sure you're all going to be very upset about that after a long day. So we're going to move right along to Margaret Kunstler on the humanitarian aid.
So my subject matter is shorter and stricter because it refers to certain importation into Cuba of medicines and humanitarian aid. And that is something that the U.S. has attempted to restrict totally, and yet we have managed to even expand that, and we can explain that later. There are two basic rules and regulations that cover those that cover export of humanitarian aid to Cuba, and those are one, the drawdown of humanitarian aid. Now that was a great achievement because originally we had to make specific licenses for each shipment of humanitarian aid. And we were small groups doing it, but we couldn't get large groups involved in the process because each shipment had to be licensed separately. So it was an impossible situation, but we didn't give up, and we started projects that were successful at following through on individual shipments. And individual shipments can still be made, and it's still a way of doing things. But now we have drawdowns, which the Commerce Department has taken over from the Treasury Department, and Commerce will grant large-scale, within reason, licenses for that you can use that cover a number of shipments. In other words, it's not per shipment; it's per what you would kind of get from the discount amount you can get from the manufacturer of drugs and other humanitarian license subjects. So that was something that is very important. The other aspect of sending humanitarian aid are individual gift packets. And that's a significant restricted subject matter, and again, it's licensed. So you have to have a license to send individual packets. But again, in this time, we shouldn't feel that this is not worth organizing over these things, because these things are really important now, and they're more important than ever. So the fact that there are restrictions should really encourage our activity to press the restrictions and go beyond them. So currently, we have a number of grassroots groups that are working within these two areas of possibility. And like the Hathaway project, which is which undertakes creative and political projects like providing materials in the wake of recent hurricanes and similar drives. And Gloria will describe what she's accomplished, which she's done amazing work in expanding these projects and making definitions that allow increased export. Charities like Global Health Partners, where Bob Schwartz, who has been a long-term activist in this forever, and we kind of started together in the 1990s with the very restricted medical aid situation. But he's doing a workshop now, and he has undertaken specific drives that have been very successful under the drawdown system, such as a syringe drive after COVID and a sutures drive. But like travel, this kind of fight back of solidarity groups has been really important. During the 1980s, humanitarian aid efforts were slow and laborious due to the licensing restrictions, where every shipment had to be applied for under the Trading with the Enemy Act. But organizers, as the group that I was part of, continued with the efforts, and the group that we were involved with, which was the U.S.-Cuba Medical Project, was specifically designed as a means of challenging the small licensing groups. And Franklin was successful in achieving the drawdown.
Good marching orders from a good client.
He was successful in achieving the drawdown over the small applications each time. And that was a tremendous victory because it allowed us to encourage larger scale charities that wouldn't deal with a single shipment, but were willing to do large-scale shipments. So that increased our abilities to ship medical aid to Cuba and was really very significant. As with travel, organizations like Pastors for Peace organize caravans. And this ability to fight the restrictions and to be bold about fighting them, and to have enough people involved so that even with the travel, not following the travel restrictions completely, there was a real problem because enforcement is more and more difficult with more and more people going against the regulations. And at certain points in time, we were successful because the restrictions and the enforcement of the restrictions the ability to enforce the restrictions were overcome by the number of people fighting the restrictions. So it's a real organizing force to get involved in this, and it's not just the horrible law that we have, but it's really important to get involved and to know the law and to figure out ways around it and to fight it, because at this time in history, getting aid to Cuba is more important than ever, and it's more important than ever when we figure out ways to fight this and to expand what we have going now. I think I've covered that already. The point is that we have been able to involve larger groups like Global Health Partners because of the expansion from the drawdowns and because of the expansions of the travel that we have worked out. So I can't tell you how you have to learn every aspect of this, and it's not complicated. Learn about the travel restrictions. Learn about how to go to make license applications. Learn about what doesn't have to be licensed, and push forward on this. It's a very important thing to be doing now, and I encourage you all. And there are many of us who are willing to help you in any way we can. So please get involved. Thank you.
Gloria Lariva with an example of what a difference it makes, and that you may try this at home and it will work. And we each have about 7 minutes.
Yes, I will talk as fast as I can. There are the legal ways, and I want to say thanks to the lawyers, from immigration activists to those who work on Cuba work, we were able to do much of this. The first time that I met Franklin Siegel was in 1994 when I was told by a Cuban in Miami they desperately need insulin. So I called around places, and Direct Relief International said, we have $1 million of insulin that Eli Lilly is willing to donate. So Franklin got us an OFAC license, that one-time license, and then Eli Lilly said, we have $2 million worth of insulin. We needed to have a travel license, and the government at one point said, every traveler on that license, from Ramsey Clark, former Attorney General, to several other people, they said, everyone has to have the same signature on that piece of paper. We fought that, we got it, and we delivered the medicine. Now, at that time, Pastors for Peace had a policy, no licenses. We were just going to break an immoral law. And I was on that first to fourth caravan. But at that point, the insulin had to be refrigerated. So we had to get the license. And we took it through Miami and over to Cuba. Then, just to jump real quick, in 2021, with that disturbance that the CIA did have a part in to try to take advantage of people's terrible situation during COVID, I decided to apply for licenses myself through the Commerce Department. The drawdown, thanks to the work of Franklin and Margaret and others, and I've gotten 8 so far. The first one was interesting because we had just taken a Hatway project delegation in 2022 to take vitamins and iron and other things that pregnant women who are at risk needed. We came back, and the next day, this terrible oil fire happened in Matanzas where 15 firefighters died, and I applied for a license, and I talked to the worker at the Commerce Department, and I wrote the letter describing the crisis. He said it takes up to 45 days to get a license. We got the license in 9 days because they recognized that that was a crisis. And we were, thanks to Dr. Lenny Villagomez, I think you're still here, we were able to get the medicines to help the survivors of that fire. We came right back, and then the crisis of the Hurricane Ian in Pinar del Rio, we got a license pretty quickly done, and we were able to deliver 37,000 pounds of construction material for rebuilding. That was under Biden. Jumping up, we decided, because the doctor said we really need cancer meds for the kids, and we made that a big project. Doctors helped us, gave us all this advice, and then we applied for what is now 2 licenses of cancer medications, very complete, and our medicines have been very life-saving, literally. The doctors have told us this. I want to say this. Everything people bring to Cuba helps, but it really also helps for people. There's a lot of people who want to help, and then they don't know what to do. Like, I'm going to Cuba, I'll bring a bag of things. I would advocate for efficiency in the way that we can. And we tell people, donate, because your medicine will literally help a kid with cancer or other serious needs. it's important that we try to collect our efforts, and that's what the Atway project does. And we've taken $250,000 in 2 years. We're going to step it up much more. It's all volunteer. Nobody gets any money from this. And the people who travel on the delegation to carry the medicine, we don't pay for their trip. They have to pay for their own trip and raise money. So a lot of youth are involved in this. I just came back from Cuba. I was there 3 times during the last month. And the last time I went, I said, I want to see a critical case because we want to bring solar power as well. The People's Forum has raised over $300,000 for solar power. They're working on it right now. But I wanted to know every place you go. And I was taken to a home, a very humble home. The deterioration of 65 years of blockade has meant no spare parts for sugar mills and not even for the homes. Hundreds of thousands have been destroyed by hurricanes in all these years. And people are still living in shelters. And I went to the home of a 10-year-old boy who's been in a coma since he was born. And this beautiful family has struggled all these years. And now with this electrical blackouts, it's like they get maybe 6 hours a day. And they told me, we have to lift him out of the bed because the hospital bed deflates. It gets very hot. He gets convulsions all day. And then they have to fan him because the electrical air conditioner fails. They're killing people, they're making the Cuban people suffer. And so we just bought 2 days ago a 5,000 watt generator and solar power for that family to try to inspire people. You can do it, but donate. Donate to these causes. Go to Cuba. You're not a tourist, you're a solidarity person. We will defy the blockade with the law or not with the law, because if they keep tightening it up, we're going to find our way to go.
Stephanie Bastinet will bring us up to date on important developments.
Going to be very quick. Okay. So 4 legs that make up the blockade. This one is the 4th leg. It's called the Helms-Burton Act. Real quick, who's heard of that? Okay, good. So Helms-Burton codified the blockade into law. So it removed the blockade from the diplomatic process, like away from diplomacy, and put it into the hands of Congress, which made it like permanent law. Also, just want to add that Helms-Burton Act is pretty uncontroversially unconstitutional. Okay, so a little context of how we got here. Before the revolution, US companies owned or controlled huge amounts of the Cuban economy. Almost 90% of Cuba's electricity generators, the telephone system, mining industry, sugarcane fields, oil refineries were all American-owned or controlled. So the whole point of the revolution, right, is to nationalize these enterprises, turn them into public assets, or like state-run enterprises. Of course, these US companies were pissed, of course. They wanted to recover the value of their property, and that was so-called confiscated. So a lot of people are using the word confiscated. That's in the act. And I can't keep doing this every time, but you know what I mean when I say confiscated. But, you know, the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, actually ruled in a landmark case, Sabatino, if you want to read it, it's really interesting, Sabatino and National City Bank. Pretty much the court held that the Cuban government's nationalization of US-owned property could not be subject to adjudication by a US court under an international law doctrine called Act of State. That's pretty straightforward, right? Like, that's pretty fair legal reasoning. Why would the US have jurisdiction here? Doesn't make sense. Well, do you think that the US companies accepted this ruling? No, they did not. So the US State Department created a kind of workaround. They created an administrative process called Foreign Claims Settlement Commission, where these pissed off US companies could file and document a claim against the Cuban government, but the actual value and accounting of their claim would be settled at some future date through the diplomatic process. So they would have to wait for US and Cuban governments through the years to kind of talk this out through diplomacy and in their attempts to normalize, their commercial relations. So basically, these claims would be certified, but then would be relegated to the diplomatic process. So a lot was based on diplomacy, right? And maybe, I don't know, hope that Cuba would eventually soften and work with the US government. Maybe that was the mindset. So this is a workaround, by the way, against the Supreme Court's decision, the Supreme Court, the highest court's decision. Now, do you think that was enough for these pissed off US companies? No, they were impatient, they hated waiting, they were unhappy with some of the value that was placed on, that was settled between the governments through negotiation. They weren't too happy with the numbers, they wanted their lawyers involved. So another workaround was plotted, and that is the Helms-Burton Act. A disaster, it's a terrible, huge blow to Cuba. But initially, the proposed law was kind of dead in 1995. It was of no real interest to members of Congress. But unfortunately, it received some revival in 1996, when Cuban fighters' jets shot down 2 planes flown by this exile group, Brothers to the Rescue. Does anybody know about that, by the way? Okay, cool. Yeah. They flew over Cuba, Cuba shot them down. Now, this was a big story, a big issue. So now Congress rushed the bill through, and it became law in 1996 under Clinton, okay? Huge blow. It did 3 things. This is what I feel. It did 3 massive, huge things, amongst other things, of course. 1, it codified the blockade. It enacted it into law, so it took it out of diplomacy, like I've said, and took it into Congress, so we would need to repeal it. We would need a new law in order for us to kind of end the blockade. It made the resolution of these property claims that I just spoke about a key condition for restoring economic and diplomatic ties. And number 3, it's called Title III. This is an interesting one and ridiculous as well. It allowed US companies to sue companies who just use property that was confiscated. Yeah, that's a big one. But Title III was not used, it wasn't really used until Trump's first term. Okay, so Helms-Burton truly put Cuban policy away from diplomacy and fully into politics. Now, this is a huge problem, right? Because this is where the powerful Florida politicians and the right-wingers sit in Congress. And now they control key parts of the embargo. So now we have a situation where, even through diplomacy, future presidents can't simply normalize relations on their own. This act this is why it's so important that we learn about it, and those lawyers or law students or those who are interested in law definitely study this law, because 1, it's unconstitutional, 2, it's really kind of in the way of any hope for us to move forward in the diplomacy, right? So we have to, I'm not saying it's impossible, it's definitely not impossible, but it is something where we have to go through the legal process of pushing for Congress to repeal. We need to start a repeal, Helms-Burton campaign or something. We have to think creatively, but we have to think through the process as well as the political elements that have to come together for this one. Okay, so the current situation, we have a great opportunity now to do something, because there are 2 cases now in the US Supreme Court, and I mean this year, okay? So arguments have already been had, yeah. So, 2 major cases.
The organizers will be hit with penalties if we stay too long.
2 cases. 1, Havana Port. Havana Docks is the former lessee, right? Former as in back in the day, back in the day. And they are suing Carnival Cruise Line for docking their cruise ships in Havana, during Obama era, okay? So again, US company who formerly had rights as a lessee is now, is the pissed company, the US company that's upset because their property rights were confiscated is now suing Carnival Cruise Line. Now, it's crazy, it's insane. So the lease expired in 2004, but Carnival is saying that it's trafficked, that they're saying that Carnival's trafficked in its former property. Second one is oil giant ExxonMobil. They're, in their capacity as a private former owner of nationalized property, they're saying they have a right to sue the current owner and claim some value there. Okay, so this is massive. If the companies have claims which will someday be resolved diplomatically, can now instead have huge court judgments against uninvolved companies, it will severely disrupt Cuba's commercial relations with companies based in countries Cuba regularly trades with, right? So this is a huge blow. Foreign companies might avoid Cuba entirely to avoid being sued in US courts. Again, how US courts have jurisdiction is unbelievable. So that's a big thing and something to watch. And the Supreme Court's ruling will be issued in late spring. And look out for it, read it, listen to the arguments made. You can check it out, I think, at the Supreme Court's website or YouTube. And that Helms-Burton cannot be ignored.
Thank you, panel. Thank you, audience. Sorry that we have to be so rushed here at the end, but we started late and they charge a lot extra. If you have questions, we had to cut out the question and answer session. Send an email to nlgcubasc@gmail.com and we'll forward the question to the appropriate panelists. Most important, if you're undertaking solidarity efforts and you need to find a lawyer, call us. If you have a lawyer, we will help your lawyer deal with this stuff, because a lot of folks say, I've never done this before. We have backup for them. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you for coming to the conference, and hope you come tomorrow for the discussion.
¡Que viva Cuba!